Hey friends, week 2, start strong, finish strong. Since this week we have a new schedule, lesson's going to go a little different. Also, Joaquin is already in bed, so he's not available to join me on the call right now. But we made a video earlier of him teaching you all the parts of this guitar, so we'll go to that next. Then we'll go to the lesson.
Joaquin, and this is the body. This is the bridge line you go. This is the pick guard. Then this is the pick, and then these are the tuners. Then these are strings.
And then what's the big opening?
Let's see. This is the Santa Claus. I'm Mr. Nick.
Okay, friends, welcome. Starting as always with our main points. Hope everyone is safe and healthy. Thinking of everyone, thinking of your families. If you're safe and healthy, be sure to check Google Classroom each week, every weekday. We're going to be changing that though with the new schedule. I'll talk about that in a moment. So you'll check in a couple times a week. Make sure you pay close attention to the new schedule so that you don't miss anything, such as class meetings, etc. And also be sure to submit your daily attendance through your advisory classroom. So, for example, today is Monday. I noticed a lot of my advisees didn't complete the daily attendance assignment. I'm assuming that's just because they either forgot because it's new or they didn't know about it. So make sure you go to your advisory classroom in Google to complete the daily attendance. Here's the new schedule looking at the whole week. We've already done 1 day of independent learning. Until spring break, independent learning will be on Mondays, which means you don't have any scheduled classes. You'll probably have a meeting with your advisor, and you'll have time to work on anything that you need to catch up on. Tuesday will be Schedule A. Schedule A is going to be periods 2 through 5. Wednesday will be Schedule B. You'll do periods 6 through 9. Then it's back to A and back to B. So you'll see each of your teachers twice a week. Because you're only seeing them twice a week, there'll be less meetings for you, but the workload may still be about the same because we still need to accomplish as much as we would on the previous schedule. But it just means you'll have more time to work independently instead of having to have all of these meetings all day long and no time to actually do the work or the learning. So looking at each day, Schedule A is going to be period 2, 3, 4, and 5 at the times that you see there on this slide. And then that will be followed in the afternoon by tutoring and advisory. So the morning is different. Periods 2 through 5 only, you see the times there, and then afternoons are the same. It's time for tutoring if you need to reach out to a teacher directly, or meeting with your advisor or reaching out to your advisor with any concerns or questions. Schedule B, same times, but it's going to be periods 6, 7, 8, and 9, and then you'll have tutoring and advisory opportunities in the afternoon. All right, so we're continuing with our World War II unit. We've moved on to our next guided reading. So first thing you need to do is make sure you made up task 5 if you forgot about it. That was the week run review. It's really important because those questions will be on the quiz next week. And it's also important because those questions will help us determine what we need to reteach, if anything, if there were any misunderstandings from last week. Next guided reading is going to be due on Friday. That's this Friday through Google Drive. There's a third guided reading for this unit. It's already been posted to Google Classroom. It's not going to be due until next week, though. And speaking of next week, we'll have that World War II quiz. Some of you will do it on Tuesday if I see you on the Schedule A, so that'll be 3rd and 4th period. And some of you do it on Wednesday. That'll be period 6, period 8, and period 9. Taking the quiz on those days. So regarding the assignments that you've been turning in, the guided readings, etc., make sure you're turning the guided readings in here by clicking on the Turn In button. And if it's a task where you're doing some writing, you need to make sure you click View Question And after you've clicked on View Question, you need to make sure that you place your answer here. If it's not enough space, just copy and paste it from a document, but make sure it's turned in there. It's the easiest way to keep track and make sure you've completed the task. All right, so within World War II, specifically today, we're going to look at the Holocaust. Oops, accidentally went back on the slides. Here we go. We're going to look at the Holocaust. There are actually three lessons that we're going to do today, AIM 5, 6, and 7. We're combining these together because we're going to have less time to meet and because all of these lessons fit together with the same theme of the Holocaust. So the first aim, how were Jews treated in Nazi-controlled territories in Europe before World War II? So our warm-up that we normally would go through would be sort of an intro to figuring out what you already know about the Holocaust. So you already know the Nazis proclaimed that the German people were a master race. The Nazis claimed that all non-German peoples, particularly Jewish people, were inferior. This racist message would eventually lead to the Holocaust. So think about, what do I already know about the Holocaust? What are things you've heard of maybe in your 6th, 7th, or 8th grade global studies classes or U.S. history classes? What do you already know about the Holocaust, perhaps from a book that you've read in English? You probably already know some things about it, okay? That's going to help us move a little more quickly through this lesson. So the first thing that we're introducing today that might be new for you is what's called the Nuremberg Laws. These were created as laws in Germany before World War II began. They are anti-Semitic, which means anti-Jewish laws that took away German citizenship from Jews. So they were no longer citizens, even if they had been born in Germany, even if their family had lived in Germany for maybe hundreds of years. They're no longer citizens. And it also outlawed marriages between Jews and non-Jews because the Germans, since they believed they were better, didn't want any Germans to be marrying any any Jews, basically, because they didn't want those two groups to mix. So, following the Nuremberg Laws, the first act of violence against Jewish soldiers, I guess I should say outright violence, they'd suffered from other violence as well, but the first large-scale event of violence was called Kristallnacht, which translates to Night of Broken Glass. So this also happened before World War II. Nazi soldiers attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues throughout Germany. And on that one night, nearly 100 Jews were murdered, in addition to all the other destruction that took place. And following that, the next event that occurs is Nazi Germany set up ghettos. Ghetto is a word that means sort of like segregated area, usually with harsh living conditions. In Germany, they segregated Jews into these overcrowded neighborhoods with horrible living conditions. For example, in one Jewish ghetto in particular, 700 people lived in an area previously occupied by just 5 families, which resulted in between 12 and 30 people living in each room. So it went from being a comfortable living situation to having hundreds of people living in where just 5 families had lived before. And sometimes you'd have 30 people sleeping in the same room. This is a photo from Kristallnacht. This is a synagogue that has been destroyed on the night of broken glass or Kristallnacht. An American wrote that Jewish shop windows by the hundreds were systematically smashed. The main streets of the city were a litter of shattered plate glass. You can see in the photo some of the destruction, and that's why it got the name Night of Broken Glass, because of all the broken glass of the businesses and the windows in people's homes and the windows in synagogues. Synagogues is a Jewish place of worship, if that's a new word for you. Hitler ordered that the Jews in all countries under his control be moved to designated cities. And you can see some of those cities here on the slides indicated with the Star of David, the Jewish Star of David there. Those were places they were moved to. In those cities, they were forced to live in these overcrowded ghettos. You can see people moving into one of those areas. And the Nazis then sealed off the ghettos with barbed wire and stone walls so that the Jewish people who were there could not leave. They hoped that the Jews inside would starve to death or die from disease. You can see a child, it looks like, laying on the ground, possibly due to starvation. And this is similar to another act of genocide that we saw during our Russian Revolution Soviet Union unit, in which it became very common for people to starve to death on the streets in Ukraine. So similar experience here where many people were starving to death or dying from disease due to malnourishment and unsanitary living conditions. Now, in the photos below, this is showing one of those walls, stone wall with barbed wire. Notice the location of the services. So on one side of the wall, you see cars driving around, you see some trolleys driving around, you see some buildings, and that's the side of the wall that the Jewish people were not permitted to go to. That was what was considered the Aryan, which Germans refer to themselves as at the time, or Christian quarter. And the other side you see here is the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw, which is in Poland, which of course the Nazis had invaded Poland in the using the Blitzkrieg technique, and that was the start of World War I. So in the ghettos, because of the lack of services, there were a lot of diseases that spread very quickly. There was a lack of food, lack of heat, and it led to a high death rate in the ghettos, which was what Hitler ultimately wanted to happen, but is very, very unfortunate for those who were there. Then later, Jews in all German-controlled areas had to wear a yellow Star of David. Many of you are familiar with this, maybe from movies you've seen or maybe from books that you've read. So normally at this point in the lesson, we would have a little discussion where we talk about motives for this. Why might people want to blame a minority group? So why might Germans want to blame a minority group such as the Jews for most of their country's problems? And we try to make some inferences. Why do you think the German people, or people in territories the Germans had taken over, why would they go along with this Nazi policy of persecution of the Jews? Which kind of goes back to, like, why did Hitler come to power? Was it that people just went along with it and he kind of manipulated them? Or was it that they really supported him and really wanted to see his goals accomplished? So were German people supporting this? Were they too afraid to speak out? Probably a combination of both. All right, so let's move on to AIM 6. So a question that probably has not been talked about in some of your other global studies classes from elementary or middle school or U.S. history classes is, what about the U.S. and the Allies during the war? Should they have done more to stop this? Could they have done more? Should they have done more? Are they responsible for not trying to do something sooner and waiting until after the war to help end this? So our warm-up normally would be, we're talking about this scenario where you are walking down the street and you come across one person attacking another person, and the attacker is much stronger than the victim, and the attacker is clearly winning this fight. So what would you do? Do you get involved? Do you leave? Do you do something else? What are the risks associated with getting involved? What are the risks with leaving? Some of the possible responses that have come up in the past. First one is, okay, I'm going to try to stop the attack by intervening, and I'm putting myself at risk, but that's worth trying to stop the attack. Maybe I feel like there's nothing I can do. I'm not strong enough to stop the attacker, but I could call the police for help. Maybe I try to distract the attacker, and when they see that someone's there, that they might stop and they might leave and get out of there. Maybe you might say, oh, I'm going to take a photo or video to record evidence of this so that maybe the police can do something later about this. And sometimes the proposed response is do nothing. I can't get involved. I don't know what's going on, or I don't feel safe getting involved. I'm just going to walk away. In that case, the risk is the attacker really gets the best of the victim, maybe beats them up really badly, or maybe even kills them. And I guess there's some of that risk with a couple others. If you're taking a photo or video to record evidence, the fight is continuing. And if you're calling the police for help, it might take them a while to show up. And so the attack continues until they get there. All right, we're going to take the warm up one level and add something to it. So imagine now it's you and your friend, John, and both of you come across the same exact thing. What would you do now that the situation has changed a little bit? You and a friend come across the same situation. So, possible responses from past students: I'm going to get involved and try to stop the attack. We'll both get involved, 2 against 1 attacker. Maybe one of you calls the police while the other person tries to stop the attack. Maybe one person tries to distract the attacker, and then the other person is going to pull the victim to safety. Maybe you're going to have one person try to record the evidence while the other person calls the police. Or, same as before, maybe both of you do nothing and you just walk away. I think the risks are the same in both cases, but maybe you have a better chance of stopping the attacker if there's 2 of you. All right, so here's our vocabulary. So vocabulary is, first, final solution. This is what Hitler came up with as his program or his plan to kill the entire Jewish population. And the result, what later became called the Holocaust. So he tried to get rid of the entire population through mass slaughter, also known as genocide of Jews, other civilians as well. It was carried out by the Nazi government in Germany and the places they had taken over. And it started before World War II with some of the events we talked about on the previous AIM, and it continued during World War II. I'll show you some photos of this. Be warned that these are pretty horrific because this was a pretty horrific time. So, Hitler soon grew impatient, waiting for Jews to die from starvation or disease. In this photo, these are bodies of children who had died either from starvation or disease in the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland. So Hitler had his security force gather up people from the ghettos and took them to pits that they shot them in, and then they buried them in those pits that they had shot them in, what became just a mass grave of dozens and dozens of bodies buried in a pit. Jews in communities not reached by the killing squads were rounded up and taken to concentration camps. Hitler hoped that the horrible conditions of the camps would speed the total elimination of the Jews. So he's hoping they would die in these camps. In addition, they built extermination camps, which is slightly different because the extermination camp, they're not waiting for people to die. They're just going to get it done with huge gas chambers that could kill as many as 6,000 people in a single day. So when people would get to the extermination camp, they were separated. Basically, they were separated by the strong, who were mostly men, who could help move bodies or do other work at the camp. And then mostly women, young children, and the elderly and the sick were separated. And those people who were labeled as weak would die the day that they got to the camp. They were told to undress for a shower. You can see people undressed in this photo, which was taken secretly and secretly taken out of the camp so the evidence could be documented. After the doors were closed, cyanide gas poured from the shower heads. All inside were killed in a matter of just minutes. Then the bodies had to be removed from the gas chamber, and those bodies had to be buried in mass graves. You can see this giant pit in the background and these dead bodies being moved by female camp guards into this pit. Later, because there were so many dead bodies, the Nazis installed crematoriums or ovens in which to burn the bodies, and they could burn hundreds and hundreds of bodies in a single day. in order to get rid of the evidence and also to not have so many bodies to dispose of because they were killing so many people. 6 million Jews died in these camps and in other Nazi massacres, and only about 4 million actually survived. So 60% of the Jewish population of Europe was eliminated in the Holocaust. Another photo of one of those mass graves. Photo of bodies that had been found after these camps were freed by the Allies. You can see that they laid them all out sort of to help hopefully identify them. And I think this is a very powerful image. This is eyeglasses of all the victims, all the people who died at this particular camp. Before they went into the chambers, they removed their eyeglasses. And you can see here, this isn't a pile of actual bodies, but all of those eyeglasses, those thousands and thousands and thousands of eyeglasses just piled here in this one pile, represent people, right? People who wore those glasses before, who have now died in these camps. And so I think it's powerful in just the sheer number of death associated with that pile of eyeglasses. So as we said before, the Jewish population was much larger in Europe before the Holocaust, and it decreased by almost 60% afterwards. The areas that lost the most were Poland and the Soviet Union. There actually were millions of Jews living in those areas that were killed by the Nazis. And the Soviet Union, this would have been areas that the Germans had taken from the Soviet Union when they invaded. So they were conducting these executions outside of their own country. Now, this photo is interesting. This is a photo of a brochure that was created by the Polish government in exile, meaning the people who were in charge of Poland but weren't there anymore because they had lost to the Nazis and they were outside of Poland now. And they were still sort of trying to keep track of what was going on in their country. And this brochure was the first document warning the Western public, meaning France, Great Britain, the United States, about the Holocaust. And this was from 1942. So even though the war doesn't end until 1945, they knew that this was taking place, right? The Allies knew. So this kind of goes back to that warm-up question of, do you get involved in trying to stop this attack or not? In addition to being warned in this brochure, the Allies actually flew over some of the extermination camps and took photos of the camps. So they knew the camps were there, but this particular photo was not examined until the 1970s. So even though they knew the photos were there, that the camps were there, and they took a photo of the camp, they did nothing to try to get the camp to become ineffective, such as bombing the gas chambers there, right? Even though some people may have died, maybe by bombing the gas chambers, they would have been able to stop the deaths that were occurring at such a fast rate. So the idea with the warm-up is, if you knew what was going on, if you could kind of see what was going on, what do? Should the Allies have done something sooner? They focused on trying to win the war, but could they have used some of their resources to fly over these camps and stop what was happening there, right? So that's aim 6, and that's going to transition us into after the war, right? So we'll give you a little bit of explanation of how the war ends. Was the Nazi leadership punished justly, which means fairly, following the defeat of Germany in World War II? So our warm-up is just a few review questions. So first review question: who was punished by the Treaty of Versailles after World War I? That should be coming to you very quickly. It was Germany. How were they punished? There's basically 4 different main things that happened that punished them. So Germany lost territory. Their military was limited in size. They had to take the blame for the war, and they had to pay reparations to the winners of the war to repair the damage from the war. What were the effects of this punishment? Well, some of the effects were that the economy was ruined. They had hyperinflation from having to print so much money. They had high unemployment. Ultimately, that led to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party and fascism in Germany. And because Hitler took over, ultimately led to World War II happening, right? So World War I's treaty to end World War I ended up resulting in World War II. Was the Treaty of Versailles fair to Germany? Most people would say no, probably not fair. Germany did not start the war. They got involved to support their ally, which was Austria-Hungary, who had already gotten involved. But the winners of World War I primarily focused on punishing Germany rather than building a long-lasting peace, rather than trying to say, okay, let's figure out what's fair, what's going to be best for our future. They said, let's figure out how to punish Germany because we won, we have all this damage, somebody's got to pay for it. All right, so by the middle of 1945, the other countries were starting to close in on Germany. So we have Great Britain here, France, Soviet Union. And the US also joined the war, which we'll talk about more in the next lesson about the circumstance of their joining. But those are the allies. Those are the allies fighting against Germany, and Germany's right in the middle. So Germany was in a really bad spot considering that they're fighting wars on both sides. And this is similar to what happened to them during World War I. So Western allies approach from the west, Soviets approach from the east, and Germany is basically getting squeezed in the middle. They got very, very desperate. They ran out of soldiers and they started drafting 12-year-olds in some cases, members of what was called the Hitler Youth, which was like a Nazi Boy Scouts. And these 12-year-olds were not prepared to fight. You can see one of them in this photo, right? Many of them died because they were fighting against grown men who were better trained, stronger, etc. So the Nazis were very desperate. The Soviets had surrounded the capital city, and they were hitting the city with a lot of firepower. You can see like all the buildings destroyed there. You can see they're raising the Soviet flag over the city in Germany. Meanwhile, while this was happening, Hitler had hid himself in an underground headquarters beneath this facility here, this bunker. On April 29th, he married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, and then the next day they both committed suicide. So he dies before World War II even ends. This is the room in which he committed suicide. And then on May 9th, the Germans surrendered unconditionally, meaning we give up, we have no terms, we're not asking for anything, we're just giving up. You can see in this photo an American soldier and a Soviet soldier sort of representing the attack from two sides, and the photo behind the sign behind them says East meets West. So the Soviets from the East and the Americans from the West, and the British and the French meet in the middle, defeat Germany, celebrate. The war was very, very destructive. 60 million people died as a result of this war. It's the most destructive war in history. In addition to deaths, cities were completely destroyed. In addition to deaths of soldiers and other people involved in the war and the destruction of buildings, of course, there was the Holocaust as well, in which 6 million Jews were exterminated. So here's a couple questions we would discuss while going through this lesson. While nations were struggling to recover politically and economically, they also tried to deal with the issue of what are called war crimes. Should the Nazi leadership and or the country of Germany be punished for their military and acts of genocide that took place during the war? If so, what would be the most fair punishment? So sometimes people say on one side, well, they lost the war and Hitler's dead, so no, they were just following his orders. They were going along with what he expected. On the other hand, some will say, no, that's no excuse. They should still be punished. Maybe a fair punishment would be life in prison or some type of prison sentence. Maybe they should be put to death just like the people that they killed. Maybe they should be sent away. Lots of different ideas about what would be fair have come up before. We'll look at what actually happened, though, and then you'll decide, was this the right thing? So these are Nazi war criminals here who were put on trial in the city of Nuremberg. So we started with the Nuremberg laws, and now we're ending with what's called the Nuremberg trials. Nazi leaders were put on trial for aggression, violation of the rules of war, and especially this idea of crimes against humanity, which was a new idea at the time. So a crime against humanity is what's considered a cruel or terrible illegal act directed against a group of people, such as genocide, for example, would be a crime against humanity. It's not a crime maybe in their country, like the Nazis could have said, hey, there was no law against it in our country. We were doing this within the laws. Our laws were that we needed to exterminate these people. However, the trials were basically saying, no, you can't just say, I was just following orders. You have to now think about, are you committing a crime against humanity? Is what you're doing morally wrong, even if it's not wrong in your country? So the result of the trials is that many of these leaders were executed. This is a photo of one of the Nazi leaders being put on the gallows to be hung immediately before his execution. This is another Nazi leader after his execution by hanging. These photos you can see are pretty brutal after the hangings. And the bodies of many of these who were executed were then burned at one of the concentration camps, and they were cremated in the same ovens that had burned so many of their victims. So they met with the same end as many of the Jews that they had exterminated. And in addition, by burning their bodies, there was no place that they were buried that people who were sympathetic to Nazis, meaning supported Nazis, could go and sort of honor them. They're completely gone, almost sort of like erased. So for your task, we did 3 aims, so there are 3 task options for you to do. You just pick one of them, one of the 3, and they're similar to formats we've already used. So task option 1 is going to be about the night of broken glass. So you basically would do a first-hand account like you did a first-hand account of the Battle of Britain. So you'd start with, I heard the sound of glass breaking, and then you're going to address the questions that are included in here. This is the corresponding reading that goes along with this one. Option 2, some historians say the US and the Allies did not take steps to stop the Holocaust. Defenders of US policy have argued that the best way to end the Holocaust was to quickly defeat Germany. So you're taking a stance one way or another. Should the Allies have diverted some of their military against concentration camps, or focus their military efforts entirely on defeating Germany, which is what they did do? Consider the pros and cons of each position. Think about the warm-up. We talked about that fight, right? Should you have intervened? What's the risk? Should you have not intervened right away and waited, etc.? All right, so for that task, you'll make a claim, explain it with evidence, explanation, counterclaim, refute. We've used this format before. This is the reading that goes along with option 2 task. Task 3, very similar. Do you think it was fair to put Nazi leaders on trial and hang some of them after their country lost World War II? So they lost the war, right? Is that punishment enough? They could say, I was just following orders. Is that a legitimate excuse? Or is there a higher moral obligation that they be put on trial because they were responsible for doing this and they could have chosen to stand up and not go along with it, etc.? For this one, it's the same as that claim counterclaim, but we want you to start with a main idea. Define a crime against humanity, because then that'll help the reader understand that you know what a crime against humanity is, and you can then discuss in your paragraph, are these considered crimes against humanity that they should be punished for? Here's the corresponding reading for this one, for option 3. So again, you're going to pick one of those 3 options. As always, don't forget, be safe, be healthy, Be with your family. Family is very, very important, right? Always important, but especially right now, okay? Check Google Classroom each weekday. For my class, it'll just be 2 days of the week you're checking in, but you got to check all your classes every day to see what's going on, okay? Pay close attention to the new schedule and be sure to submit your daily attendance through your advisory classroom. Thanks for joining me, and we'll move on to our closing of the lesson. All right, that's a wrap, friends. Thank you for keeping up, and hope you learned a lot about the guitar back there from Joaquin's video. Week 2, stay strong. We'll get through this together.